I think there's different kinds of umbrella companies that are out there. I think Capita Resourcing, they've done a due diligence on umbrella companies because there are hundreds and hundreds that have popped up, some specifically to manage the IR35 risk. Problem is, a lot of them are not compliant. So I know an external Big Four firm has done a review of them, and they found about 25% of them were compliant. So I think that's not how they work. How they work is that they employ the worker and put them under PAY and NIC. The issue is that a good chunk of them might try to do something a bit racy, pay via loans, use trusts offshore, point schemes, all sorts of things to come to us, we'll get you the best net pay. So that's why when you get to using umbrella companies, you really got to be sure that they're kosher, that they're paying full PAY and IC. And so I think Capita Resourcing have a proper due diligence, preferred list.
Yeah, so right now we refresh that on at least an annual basis, if not more often. And we will only operate right now with 8 umbrella companies because, as Stuart said, there's hundreds. But there's only a very few that we believe through the due diligence that we do that are good to work with.
And the other thing to consider for that worker is they have to pay a fee to get paid as such for the services. So you will see that people will go through that umbrella company sometimes because they're told they can get a better net pay. But when you balance it all out, they may as well go PAYE directly with maybe a supplier where the payroll function and that administration is actually funded by the supplier themselves rather than having to pay for it directly.
I mean, the reason that you might go to an umbrella company is if you're moving around a lot and you want to have, as a contractor, one standard ongoing payroll, PAY reference, easy with HMRC. That's why they work and why the good ones work.
A few things. I think one of the things is what I mentioned earlier, which is the obligation on the end client to provide an appeals process directly to the worker. We'll see in the final results whether that's something that is put in place, but that's different.
Most respondents were against that.
Yeah,
doesn't mean you won't be there.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because typically in business-to-business relationships, communication flows in line with the contractual mechanism that's in place. So creating an obligation to go around that is a bit of an odd one. But that's something that I do know is proposed that is different from the public sector.
One thing about the banks, that's not to say that's how the whole market will go, but one thing about the banks is they can't recover their VAT. So if you have a contractor where you suddenly have to pay, they invoice you through a limited company, you have to pay the employer's national insurance because they're caught and you can't recover the VAT. It makes no sense. Hence, that's why it makes more sense for banks to go cost neutral and perhaps employ them or just go to employers next. So it might be different. Other than that, I think it's everyone's making it's a decision point time really. Yeah. I think in terms of the private sector outside.
And we did see some in the public sector go down the route of blanket decisions, and in the cases where we did see that within 6 months, they'd reversed those decisions because it unduly affected their ability to engage with the right skills. And if we think back to that, the drive now and over the next couple of years for organisations to engage with flexible talent, that kind of blanket decision really affected the organisation's ability to get the right skills into the business. So I think there's a couple of things in play there. It's yes, thinking about the cost implications, but also how do we get the right skills into the business and change the channels, as Jess was indicating earlier.
I think that happened in the public sector and it ended up being chaotic, to be honest. So I think the benefit that everyone has here is to really plan ahead. And I think one of the triggers was the CES tool kept changing, so there wasn't a final tool. But if you think even when the legislation came in, the timesheets that were captured after that date were then caught within the legislation, even though the contract was prior to that. So there was all this reverting of changing of contracts in retrospect that had to be actioned, so the volume of work. So I think the opportunity here is to get your models right, and there's no problem with you starting that process of saying, are they in or out, and actually starting to your new hiring to actually accommodate down the right route that's going to bring you in the right resource under the right kind of contract when it does happen. So yeah, it's interesting, and it's also keeping up to date with any new legislation that comes through, or the new case law really, because you can be following the correct legislation, but then some case law puts a different perspective on it, so you've got to constantly change how you're managing that workload.
With regard to the CES tool, HMRC did indicate to us that they're planning a next facelift on that for August. So again, that's another reason why we recommend and feel quite strongly that CEST is probably the best tool, because that's what HMRC are basing their view on, and likely they're going to base their investigations on in terms of what's important, what they're focusing on. And if you're using a different tool, how is that keeping up with, you know, HMRC's change in direction? Because they are going to keep updating this and shifting it as we go through.
And I think that data storage of those instances, so it's not just done once in a lifetime or at the beginning. A lot of our customers do this on an annual basis or biannual basis. You've got to store that data for that decision for a period of time to make sure you can revert back to it. Because, as you say, if things are going to change, then they might move from in or out, or vice versa. So,
I mean, with CES, there is criticism. Everyone knows there's criticism about the tool externally, but you know, fair enough. Maybe it is slightly weighted towards employment, but at the end of the day, we're here to manage our risk. And if that's the only tool that's HMRC will stand by if completed correctly, then that's the only place you can sit totally happy. How much they're going to change it before August, I don't know. I don't know how much of it, as Gemma said, is just a facelift. I think it'll look nicer, maybe more user-friendly. There may be some more questions in there, but will it deliver different answers than it did before? I'm not sure.
The tool was only made available to the public sector 2 weeks before the go live in 2017. So yes, as Jess quite rightly said, it was, you know, for those organisations, it really felt quite chaotic. So I'd like to say that HMRC have learned from that. I know they did an awful lot of roundtables in the lead up to the consultation and throughout the consultation on rolling it out in the private sector. So I'd be very surprised if there is changes in it that affect determinations right up until that last minute, like it was in 2017.
I think it's making setting your talent strategy up right and knowing where you're going to go for certain types of resources. So understanding where are you hiring from the moment? Are they purely limited company? Are they already PAYE or under umbrella company? In which case, it doesn't really affect whether they're in or out because they're already being taxed and NI'd. But also looking at your service providers, who are you using to go for those? Are they compliant? So I think it's more doing an audit of your current resources, and then starting to educate those hiring managers on, okay, you might have a critical resource that's sitting here, a niche scale, but we need to have a plan to actually build our own maybe. How do you develop that over time? Because effectively, that's probably your critical key niche skills are going to be the area where you're going to be forced your hand to actually accommodate any increases that they might want to retain that skill set.
There's planning for the budget, 2020 budget, isn't there? What the potential costs are. So even for April 2020 and whether somebody's actually going to be caught, it's knowing now what the business need to anticipate in terms of potential increased costs. Yeah. That's why it's worth doing it now, even if those contractors don't actually ever work for you after April 2020.
And it's that employer's NI that tended to be the real sticking point with those contractors that were limited company in scope, that they understand their own tax and their own employees' NI is fair, but it was that employer's national insurance contribution that we saw was a question mark, and the organisations were saying it's nothing to do with us, and the contractors were like, I'm not taking that. So that was the real sticking point. What's your decision on, are you going to accommodate that or not?
And if you are going to try and go cost neutral, you have to renegotiate the rates. You can't just knock off the employer's national insurance off them. You have to agree a lower rate. So obviously, they're now lower rate starting point. PAY and NIC employees up front there's a big chunk. That decision is a big impact on the net pay of the individual. So.
And test your workforce. Some of them will wait until the last minute, and with the public sector, we sort of saw them sort of experience it for 6 weeks and then drop out. So they wanted to really feel what was the impact. So I think it's important to communicate with your contractor workforce and understand that they're going to be willing, if that is the outcome, that's an environment they're going to continue to want to engage with you. So I think it's about having lots of contingency plans for different scenarios and really start to educate. There are multiple ways that we can engage this resource. How are we going to manage that?
And depending on your organisation, I think the point I made at the top of the presentation is that what we saw is, as it's levelled out in the public sector, is about 90% are in scope. So if you have determined early that those individuals are in scope, the population that you need to focus on in terms of perhaps rechecking if there are any changes is probably that 10%, because it's that's presenting you potential risk. If they're in scope and the deductions are being made, from a risk and compliance perspective, you're pretty much covered early.
It could happen, but I wouldn't plan your business on the basis that it's not going to happen. Draft legislation is out next week. If it's not in there, I think there'll be a lot of people. I think the biggest surprise. Things always pop out of the woodwork, don't they? Different schemes to avoid things, but HMRC have changed their tack about avoidance schemes, and as soon as they pick it up, there's a spotlight about it. At the moment, it's the loan charge. I don't know if you heard about that. So a lot of people getting hit with that. I know that there's things, parliamentary reviews going on about that, about the human rights and the fairness of it, but they're going after everything now.
Yeah, right. 5.1 million on the balance sheet, 10 million turnover, and 50 employees.
2 of the 3, I think.
Yeah. So that you can see at the kind of SME end of the, the kind of,
So in the first consultation, I think we were saying no. Don't, we'd heard the rumours that they were going to take out one layer from it, and it just creates an unlevel playing field, scope for avoidance. But they were trying to encourage entrepreneurial.
Yeah, I think there's still
tie them up in red tape.
There's strong agenda to support SME organisations and not overly, affect their ability to grow. Having said that, much like it happened in the public sector, there was no surprise it's being introduced in the private sector. Again, another couple of years, it will probably be extended to, possibly.
Well, they don't really care about blanket determination if they're in scope. They'll say they do. They'll say they do to the contractors, but obviously they don't care. They only care if you blanket determine they're out of scope.
And equally, they insist that in the public sector, blanket decisions wasn't a thing. They've got no evidence that was happening. Our experience would suggest otherwise, but.
Minor tweaks possible. The CES tool isn't going to change much. The latest case I saw was last week, and it was a doctor and working in 2 different hospitals, practically the same, but one was found in scope, one was found out of scope, because one, even though 90% of the arrangements were the same, in one they had a substitution clause in the contract with the hospital, and there was a couple of other tiny bits around no notice. So it was interesting that you mentioned that. These things, they seem minor, but when you've got a case where it's 50-50, a judge has said that's enough to tip it into self-employment. So on their own, they're not necessarily enough, but when you add them in to the equation, it can make a decision. I think case law, I think they'll probably be happy with that HMRC. They got a 50% answer on that one. So
going on their success rates, I think they'll be happy with that. But clearly with their resources, challenging individuals has not gone in their favour. But the weight of the investigation behind an organisation with 1,000 contractors is it's a different playing field then, isn't it?
I think, I mean, obviously, if you've got a rate card, there'll be some sort of banding in that. And I think most of them, it was just the small exceptions that would come through at a different rate, or the hiring manager will just classify them in a different banding that allowed them to do that. But I think the minimum you'll see is the employer's NIC, but then it could go as extensive as well. I want to recoup my tax. It's 25%, and my own employees. So it can be.
Yeah, and what we saw in the public sector is why there was an immediate impact in the availability of talent. So it just became unavailable. I think because they thought they would swap into the private sector. But over the kind of preceding 6 months, that had returned to volume. And then with that, so, day one, cost neutral, everyone's transitioned over where organisations were holding to their rate card. As Jess was saying, over the next 6 to 12 months, what we saw is that, now when they're bringing people in and that population shifting and new talents coming in, they're coming in at the top of the rate card, whereas it used to be average at the middle. They're coming in at the next banding of that rate card. So overall, when you assess that population on a case by case, it's still working with the rate card. But overall, there was that marked shift in the cost of that total population. So we will for our own purposes, we would be assessing that with our clients on a regular basis, probably every 3 months, to really look at the total cost of those populations and analyse what the trends are and what areas are being impacted. Not least because we want to work with our partners to look at what the other channels are, in order to balance out those cost changes. You're going to have to engage with contractors in some cases because they are the skills and they are only presented to you through that mechanism. But, there are ways of engaging talent to offset some of that increased cost.
Such as the ERM?
Yeah, that's one route. Also looking and really understanding how you would potentially build that talent or train talent effectively so that you've got them up to competency within 3 months, for example. There's a whole host of options that we would be looking to work with people on. This was a case, as I was saying, that although the question of the substitution didn't arise, it was that the judge relied on.
It was possible, yes. Yeah. I mean, so it wasn't only the substitution clause, but it's a bit like this doctor one. That it was, I guess, it was a case that was in the balance. So I think, as Gemma said earlier on, if substitution is in point and is absolutely what's termed unfettered, as in absolutely they could send someone else, no, the client can't say no. It's always going to be accepted. That's all you need to prove. But in this case, it was okay. It's in the balance. Now, substitution, does that have some weighting? It was in the contract and it was found to be valid. And as it was proved to have occurred with the DWP, it had happened in 3 or 4 other occasions. Yeah. So that's where Capita went into the tribunal and helped. HMRC aren't happy with the fact that something, just a contractual clause. I think most contractors will have that in their contract as standard. In most cases, it's not going to tip them to be self-employed, but it's certainly going to support in a borderline case. And what's key on that is they want to see substitution clause to be valid throughout the whole chain. So obviously, if you're in there's not just one chain where you pay a contractor and then they do the work, and if it has a substitution clause, that's the end of it. There are a number of people in the chain. There's an agency, there might be another a company in the chain. And if somewhere in that chain, substitution isn't found to be valid, HMRC will go after it and say, actually, well, they wouldn't have allowed it, so you can't have it. So I think that's something to bear in mind about your contractual chain and the fact that if you have conditions in it, they repeat themselves through the contractual chain.
Yeah. So again, really thinking about that supply chain piece and understanding who are all the parties in play within that supply chain, right down to the fee payer, and how do you build the relationships so that you can monitor that and build the contractual and the commercial engagements in such a way that you are setting those up to support throughout that chain.
That's the other thing, I suppose, that's proposed to change in the legislation, is that securing your supply chain is what HMRC want you to do. They don't want these dodgy umbrella companies, etc., to exist. So their way to get around that is to basically say that if somebody in your chain fails to operate PAYE when they were supposed to, and they go under or disappear, it's going back up the chain up to, so there's like a transfer of liability. So you can't wash your hands with passing on liabilities to a supply chain where the company goes under. You'll still be exposed under the proposed new legislation.
And another case that we're involved with, there was the client had done the right thing, and through ourselves as a neutral vendor, we engaged with a supplier who then engaged with a contractor that was through an umbrella company, their own limited company, then changed to another umbrella company, and all 5 parties were included in a tribunal where that clear breakdown of what their pay was and who, how is their gross rate that they were used to being paid as a limited company contractor break down into elements of holiday pay, which is the specific one. So sometimes the organisation isn't fully aware, but that you can still be involved in those tribunals if that information hasn't passed down. And it was actually with the umbrella companies. One of them acted correctly, the other one hadn't, said, well, actually, your net pay is now this amount because 16%, for example, is your holiday pay. So it can be quite complicated. So I think it's making sure that those contracts and those audits, you've got somebody that's working with you to make sure that you're not going to inadvertently be included in any of those tribunals.
Time was part of it. I think in one of them there was maybe a potential set amount of hours that he would agree to do week to week, and the other one, there wasn't that expectation. He might have done it, but maybe on a Friday he would say, I'm not going to come in this Friday, and that was fine. So it does play into it, but I don't think that you can say just because they're part-time they're out of scope because you don't use them all the time because you have part-time employment. Then I suppose you come into the question of, are they integrated into the organisation? But if you're always working for one place, you're not really in business in your own account probably, unless you're doing that at lots of different places. So it's not of itself that working a long time makes you employed. It's what it implies. And when tribunals look at this, they look at the whole picture and they see that someone working at an organisation for 9 years, they might have a substitution clause in the contract, and they maybe once sent it, maybe years and years and years ago. That, standing back, they might say yes, but I don't think that's enough to take you out because everything else points towards a reliance and a sort of master-servant relationship. So it's a factor, but because of what it implies, I would say.
No one element on its own would singularly determine an in or out. In any case, I think everything that we've seen has been a combination of a collective of elements, both contractual and working practices within the organisation, which doesn't help make it easy.
I think this is the thing. The decision is far too difficult. These cases, they're pages and pages and pages, and then you don't necessarily know how they're going to conclude, right? So you could argue either side of the case in any case. That's why you need a tool. And it doesn't, in a sense, it doesn't matter if it's what a tribunal would decide, because a tribunal could decide one thing depending on what judge it was and how they felt that day. All you need is something, a risk management tool that you can rely on. So it's not, is it the answer? It's HMRC says this is the answer because we put that in the tool and therefore we can rely on it. The technical debate about employed and self-employed goes on forever, so that's where you want to avoid those arguments with the contractors, because you never get to a satisfactory conclusion. You just got to rely on something that's HMRC have put out there, I think. I mean, I would say those kind of training activities, which are sort of regulatory, I would say no. But you might use it as a factor in the whole piece, but I would say it's a really minor factor. So I've heard of contractors not wanting to do that because it'll make me employed. Well, if it's that tight that it relies on whether you do a regulatory training, then you're far too borderline already. Of itself, there's no way that's significant enough to change anything.
Well, thank you everyone for all your questions. A big round of applause to our